The men in black suits arrived before Dane Calloway could even finish his celebratory beer. 3 hours. That's all it took for his dream property purchase to become a federal crime scene. He'd won the auction at noon with dreams of financial freedom. By 3 p.m., those dreams were buried under federal investigation equipment. He stood on his newly acquired porch, watching a dozen agents swarm his 40 acres with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar equipment, their vehicles blocking the only road out. The lead agent, a sharp-eyed woman with a FinCEN badge, had shown him a warrant that mentioned his property by its exact GPS coordinates. But here was the thing that made his blood run cold. The warrant was dated yesterday, a full day before he'd even placed his winning bid. Dane had bought the abandoned Hollister Ranch at the Cochise County auction that morning, paying $230,000 for what he thought was a steal. The previous owner, according to county records, had died intestate 6 months ago with no heirs. Clean paperwork, clear title, no liens. He'd done his homework as any experienced property broker would. 27 years in real estate had taught him to spot problems before they cost him money. This should have been simple. Buy low, renovate the main house, subdivide the acreage, and sell high to city folks wanting their piece of Arizona sky. The ranch sat 15 miles northeast of Wilcox, far enough from town to offer real privacy, but close enough to utilities. Perfect for his retirement plan. At 62, Dane's back couldn't handle much more of climbing through attics and crawl spaces, showing properties to clients who changed their minds twice a week. This flip would set him up nicely, maybe even let him help his daughter Sarah with her medical school loans, and buy that cabin in Montana he'd been dreaming about since his Army days. But the moment he'd walked the property boundaries after signing the papers, something felt wrong. The main house was standard ranch architecture, built in the 1980s. Nothing unusual there. The barn needed work, but had good bones. What caught his attention were the subtle irregularities in the landscape. Areas where the desert scrub grew differently, patches where the soil looked disturbed despite years of weathering. And then there were the utility connections that didn't match county records. 3 separate electrical meters for a single-family property, underground cables running to what appeared to be empty ground. When he'd started poking around with a metal detector he'd brought to check for buried pipes, the signals were immediate and strong. Not random nails or fence wire, but large, geometric shapes beneath the surface. Rectangular patterns too perfect to be natural, too big to be septic systems. He'd called his lawyer, Meredith Torres, to ask about mineral rights and utility easements, standard due diligence. But before she could even return his call, the federal convoy had appeared on his horizon like vultures sensing carrion. Now Agent Victoria Cross was studying the same readouts from her team's equipment that had made Dane's metal detector scream. The worst part wasn't the agents or the warrant, or even the growing certainty that his retirement dream was evaporating. It was the look in Agent Cross's eyes when she'd first seen him. Not surprise, not confusion, but recognition, like she'd been expecting him all along. Agent Cross approached with the measured stride of someone used to delivering bad news. Her team had been working for over an hour now, methodically scanning grid patterns across his property with equipment that looked like it belonged in a NASA facility rather than rural Arizona. Each piece of machinery bore federal seizure tags and warning labels that made Dane's stomach tighten. "Mr. Calloway, we need to discuss your purchase," she said, pulling out a tablet with satellite imagery of his land. "When did you first become aware of the underground installations?" "Underground what?" Dane kept his voice level, though his heart was hammering. 3 decades of negotiating real estate deals had taught him never to show weakness. "I bought this property at a legal auction this morning. Clean title, no issues flagged by the county." Cross showed him the screen. The satellite images were recent, high resolution, and revealed heat signatures beneath the ground that formed distinct patterns. Rectangular structures, approximately 30 feet by 15 feet, buried 8 feet down across multiple locations on his property. The thermal imaging showed they were insulated and temperature controlled. "These installations have been monitored for 18 months, Cross explained. The previous owner, Marcus Hollister, was operating a cryptocurrency mining facility, industrial scale, the kind that processes transactions for organizations that prefer anonymity. Dane's real estate experience kicked in. Mining operations require massive electricity usage. The utility company would have records. They bypassed the grid. Cross pointed to areas on the tablet where underground cables snaked toward the main highway. Illegal tap into the high-voltage transmission lines. Stolen power worth approximately $2 million over 2 years. That makes this property evidence in a federal theft investigation. The implications hit him like a physical blow. His entire investment, his retirement plan, potentially seized as evidence. I had no knowledge of any of this. I bought the property legally. We know. Cross studied his face carefully. That's what's interesting. Marcus Hollister died 6 months ago. Natural causes, according to the medical examiner. But someone's been maintaining these systems. The electrical draw didn't stop after his death. Someone with technical knowledge. Someone with access. A new federal vehicle arrived, this one carrying what looked like excavation equipment. Dane watched them unload a small backhoe and realized they weren't just investigating. They were planning to dig. Today. The county auction was expedited, Cross continued. Usually, interstate properties sit in probate for a year or more. This one was rushed through in 6 months. Someone wanted this property sold quickly, to the right buyer. What's that supposed to mean? It means either you're incredibly unlucky, Mr. Calloway, or someone wanted to make sure you specifically ended up owning this land. Cross closed the tablet. Given your military background and security clearance history, we're leaning toward the latter. Dane's mouth went dry. His Army service had ended 15 years ago. Routine discharge, nothing classified or controversial. He'd spent 2 decades selling houses to retirees and young families. Why would anyone target him? But as he watched federal agents begin marking excavation sites with orange spray paint, a memory surfaced. 3 months ago, a man had approached him about this exact property, before it was even listed for auction. The man had seemed to know details about Dane's financial situation, his retirement timeline, even his preference for rural properties. The man who'd claimed his name was William Hayes, the same name that had appeared on the utility bypass installation, according to the documentation Agent Cross had just shown him. The first excavation hit concrete at exactly 8 feet down. Agent Cross called for additional equipment, while Dane watched his investment literally disappear into a growing crater. The concrete structure revealed itself slowly as agents carefully cleared away decades of accumulated soil and desert debris. What they uncovered wasn't just a mining operation. It was a sophisticated data center, climate-controlled and lined with industrial-grade servers, equipment that hummed with electrical current despite being buried for years. Fiber optic cables ran through conduits that connected multiple underground chambers across his property. This wasn't some amateur cryptocurrency setup. It was military-grade infrastructure. Jesus, one of the excavation team members muttered, shining a high-powered flashlight into the chamber. This thing's still operational. Cross immediately called for a cybercrime specialist while securing the area with yellow tape. She turned to Dane, her expression now containing something that might have been sympathy. Mr. Calloway, I need you to think very carefully. The man who approached you 3 months ago, William Hayes. Describe him. Dane closed his eyes, forcing himself to remember details. Tall, maybe 6'2". Well-dressed but not flashy. Expensive watch, though. Said he was a private investor looking for land deals before they went public. Claimed he'd heard I was good at spotting undervalued properties. How did he contact you initially? Phone call to my office. Said he got my number from a satisfied client, but he wouldn't say which one. The memory sharpened as he spoke. He knew things about my business that weren't public. My military service, my specialty in rural properties, even my retirement timeline. Cross was taking notes on her phone. Did he try to steer you toward this specific property? Not directly. He asked about upcoming auctions in Cochise County. Said he was particularly interested in properties with development potential. When I mentioned the Hollister Ranch was scheduled for auction, he seemed very interested but said he couldn't attend personally. Asked if I'd be willing to bid on his behalf. But you bid for yourself instead. He never followed up. I called him twice after our initial meeting. Left messages, but he never returned my calls. The number went dead last month. Dane felt sweat forming despite the cool November air. You think he wanted me to buy this place? Before Cross could answer, her radio crackled with urgent chatter. The cybercrime specialist had arrived and was already descending into the excavated chamber with specialized equipment. Within minutes, his voice came over the radio with news that made Cross's face go pale. The servers are running active transactions, multiple virtual private networks, offshore cryptocurrency exchanges, and what looks like real-time money laundering protocols. We're talking millions of dollars cycling through here every hour. Cross grabbed her radio. Can you isolate the connections without shutting down the operation? Negative. This system's got fail-safes. Any interruption triggers automatic data wipes and server destruction. Whoever built this was prepared for discovery. Dane watched Cross process this information, her jaw tightening with each revelation. She was dealing with something far beyond a simple theft investigation. This was organized crime, possibly international, using his property as a digital laundering facility. There's something else, the specialist's voice continued over the radio. The system's monitoring software shows recent access logs. Someone's been remotely administrating these servers. Last login was this morning at 11:45, 15 minutes before Dane had won the auction. Someone had been watching, waiting, possibly even ensuring he would be the winning bidder. But why him? What made a small-town real estate broker the perfect patsy for a sophisticated criminal operation? The answer came when Cross received a text message that made her expression shift from concern to alarm. She showed Dane the screen, a photograph of his truck, taken that morning at the auction house, with a timestamp and a message that read simply, Phase 2 initiated. Agent Cross immediately ordered a tactical response team while studying the photograph on her phone. The image had been taken from across the street at the courthouse, showing perfect clarity of Dane's license plate and timestamp. Someone had been watching the auction, documenting his victory, and transmitting real-time updates to whoever was running this operation. Mr. Calloway, I need complete transparency from you right now, Cross said, her tone shifting to interrogation mode. Your military service record shows specialized communications training. Electronic Warfare Division, Fort Gordon. You maintained a secret clearance for 12 years. Dane felt the ground shifting beneath him again. His Army communications training had been routine signal intelligence work, nothing that would prepare him for sophisticated criminal operations. That was 15 years ago. I processed radio intercepts and managed field communications equipment. Basic stuff. Basic enough to configure underground data centers and cryptocurrency mining operations? Absolutely not. I can barely manage my office computer system. But even as he said it, Dane realized how convenient his background looked. A former military communications specialist with real estate expertise. Perfect for someone who needed legitimate cover for illegal infrastructure. The cybercrime specialist emerged from the underground chamber carrying a laptop and several hard drives. His face was grim as he approached Cross. We've got a problem. The system's running something called Operation Desert Cash. It's processing financial transactions for at least 6 different criminal organizations. Cartel money, arms-dealing profits, human trafficking proceeds. We're looking at maybe $50 million in transactions over the past year. Cross turned back to Dane. The previous owner, Marcus Hollister. Did you ever meet him personally? Never. He died before I started researching the property. Dane tried to remember everything he'd learned about Hollister during his due diligence. County records showed he was a tech contractor, worked remotely. Neighbors said he kept to himself. Marcus Hollister was a federal informant, Cross revealed. He'd been cooperating with FinCEN for 2 years, helping us track cryptocurrency laundering networks. His death wasn't natural causes. It was murder made to look like a heart attack. Professional work. The revelation hit Dane like physical force. He'd bought property from a murdered federal informant. Property that was still actively being used for criminal purposes. No wonder the federal response had been so swift and overwhelming. Someone killed him to take control of this operation, Cross continued. But they needed a legitimate owner, someone who could hold clear title without raising suspicions. Enter William Hayes, who spent months researching the perfect candidate and steering you toward this purchase. A second federal vehicle arrived, this one containing what appeared to be a mobile command center. Agents began setting up satellite communication equipment and multiple computer workstations. This wasn't just an investigation anymore, it was becoming a major operation. Cross received another message on her secure phone. Her expression darkened as she read it. Mr. Calloway, someone just transferred $230,000 into your business checking account. The exact amount you paid for this property. The transfer originated from an offshore cryptocurrency exchange. Dane stared at her in disbelief. That's impossible. I used my own money? Check your phone, Cross interrupted. When Dane accessed his banking app, there it was. A deposit made 30 minutes ago, doubling his account balance. The payment reference simply read, Phase 2, welcome home. Cross immediately contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force while ordering agents to secure Dane's banking information as evidence. The money transfer wasn't just a payment, it was a message. Someone wanted him to understand that his purchase had been funded by the same criminal network that was using his land. "We're freezing all your accounts pending investigation," Cross informed him. "That money is proceeds from criminal activity. Accepting it makes you complicit in money laundering, whether you knew it or not." Dane watched his retirement savings become inaccessible with a few keystrokes on Cross's laptop. Everything he'd worked for, frozen indefinitely. How could they access my banking information? The same way they accessed everything else about your life, Mr. Calloway. Someone's been planning this for months, possibly longer. Cross showed him a thick file that had materialized from the command vehicle. William Hayes doesn't exist. The identity was created 6 months ago using sophisticated document forgery. But we know who's really behind this. The file contained surveillance photographs of a man Dane recognized immediately, the well-dressed stranger who'd approached him about investment opportunities. But these photos were taken at known criminal locations across 3 states, meeting with cartel financial advisors in El Paso, consulting with arms dealers in Phoenix, coordinating with human trafficking coordinators in Tucson. "His real name is Chen Mingwei," Cross explained. "Former Chinese military intelligence, now freelance. He specializes in what he calls financial infrastructure development for international criminal organizations. He builds these underground data centers, then finds legitimate Americans to serve as unwitting fronts." Dane studied the photographs with growing horror. The man had seemed so professional, so legitimate during their meeting. "How many people has he done this to?" "You're the 4th we know about. The previous 3 are all serving federal prison sentences for financial crimes they never understood they were committing." Cross closed the file. "Chen's operation is simple but effective. He identifies targets with useful backgrounds and financial motivation, manipulates them into buying properties that are already equipped for criminal purposes, then uses their legitimate ownership as cover." The cybercrime specialist approached with urgent news. "Agent Cross, we've isolated the communication protocols. The system's receiving real-time commands from someone using Chen's personal encryption keys. He's actively managing this operation right now." Cross grabbed her radio. "All units, suspect may be in the immediate area. Chen Mingwei. Consider him armed and extremely dangerous." But as federal agents spread across Dane's property to search for Chen, Dane realized something that made his blood run cold. During their original meeting 3 months ago, Chen had asked detailed questions about the property's access roads, sight lines, and neighboring ranches. He hadn't just been planning a money laundering operation, he'd been conducting reconnaissance. Chen knew this land better than Dane did. He'd probably been using it as an operational base for months before Hollister's death, which meant Chen wasn't running this operation remotely from some distant location. He was already here, somewhere on the 40 acres that Dane now officially owned, waiting for Phase 2 to begin. And based on the federal response, Phase 2 wasn't just about money laundering. The tactical team's equipment suggested they were preparing for something far more dangerous. Dane's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Walk to the old well behind the barn. Come alone, or Agent Cross dies tonight." Dane stared at the threatening message while federal agents continued their systematic excavation around him. The old well behind the barn sat roughly 300 yards from the main activity, hidden behind a cluster of mesquite trees that would provide perfect cover for an ambush. Chen had chosen his location carefully. Agent Cross was coordinating the cybercrimes team near the primary excavation site. Her back was turned to Dane as she studied technical readouts on multiple laptop screens. She had no idea that a professional killer was somewhere on the property, using her own investigation as cover for whatever Phase 2 actually entailed. Dane deleted the threatening message and walked casually toward Cross, his mind racing through options. Running wasn't possible with federal agents surrounding the property. Calling local law enforcement would take too long and might escalate the situation beyond control. But he couldn't just ignore a direct threat against Cross's life, even if she represented everything that was destroying his future. "Agent Cross," he said, approaching her work area with forced calm. "I need to check the irrigation system behind the barn before your people dig there. Old wells can be dangerous if they're not properly marked." Cross looked up from her screens with sharp eyes that seemed to evaluate every word. "Mr. Calloway, you're not authorized to move freely around this crime scene. Any inspection needs to be conducted with federal supervision." "Then send someone with me," Dane suggested. "The well's been capped for years, but if your excavation equipment hits it wrong, you could have a serious safety problem." It was a reasonable request, the kind of practical concern that property owners raised during investigations. Cross studied his face for several seconds, then nodded to one of her agents. Rodriguez, escort Mr. Calloway to check the irrigation infrastructure. Standard precautions. Agent Rodriguez was young, maybe 28, with the precise movements of someone fresh from federal training. He carried a sidearm and radio, but his attention seemed focused on documenting every detail of their walk, rather than watching for threats. Exactly the kind of federal oversight that would get them both killed if Chen was as professional as his background suggested. As they approached the barn, Dane noted the sight lines and cover positions that Chen would have identified during his reconnaissance. The well sat in a natural depression surrounded by mature trees and scattered boulders, invisible from the main activity area. Perfect for a confrontation that needed to happen away from witnesses. Rodriguez was already radioing their position back to Cross when Dane spotted the first sign that they weren't alone. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt near the well, recent enough that the desert wind hadn't filled them with sand. Chen had been using this location recently, possibly as a base of operations while monitoring the federal investigation. Agent Rodriguez, Dane said quietly, we need to go back immediately. This area isn't safe. But Rodriguez was examining the well's concrete cap, noting structural details for his report. Mr. Calloway, this infrastructure appears sound. Why would you be concerned about safety issues? Before Dane could answer, a voice spoke from the mesquite trees with calm authority. Because he knows I'm here, Agent Rodriguez, and he knows that you're about to become a demonstration of what happens when federal agencies interfere with my business operations. Chen Mingwei emerged from behind the largest mesquite tree with the controlled movements of someone accustomed to violence. He appeared exactly as he had 3 months ago, well-dressed, professional, unremarkable, except for the tactical vest now visible under his jacket and the military-grade communications equipment attached to his belt. Agent Rodriguez reached for his weapon, but Chen raised one hand in a gesture that was somehow both peaceful and threatening. Agent Rodriguez, your radio and sidearm, please. Place them on the ground slowly. Mr. Calloway and I have business to discuss. You're under arrest, Rodriguez said, though his voice carried uncertainty. He was trained for federal investigations, not armed confrontations with international criminals in remote locations. Actually, I'm not, Chen replied calmly, because Agent Cross and her team are about to discover that their investigation has been carefully guided to this exact moment. Every piece of evidence they've found, every connection they've made has been placed deliberately to bring us to this conversation. Dane felt the pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. You wanted the feds here. This whole thing was designed to create this situation. Chen smiled with genuine appreciation. Very good, Mr. Calloway. Marcus Hollister wasn't just an informant. He was my partner. We've been running this operation for 3 years. Feeding carefully selected information to FinCEN while processing much larger transactions through networks they never suspected existed. Rodriguez was still holding his weapon, though he hadn't drawn it completely. That doesn't make sense. Why kill your own partner? Because Marcus developed a conscience, Chen explained. He wanted to shut down the operation and disappear with his share of the profits. But what do you do when your criminal partner wants out? Chen's solution was as cold as it was effective. Unfortunately, my clients had invested considerable resources in this infrastructure. Shutting down wasn't an option. The communications equipment on Chen's belt crackled with coded transmissions in what sounded like Spanish and Chinese. He was coordinating with multiple teams, possibly surrounding the entire federal operation. This wasn't a desperate criminal making final moves. It was a professional executing a carefully planned strategy. The murder was simple, Chen continued. A heart attack induced by an untraceable compound. But managing the aftermath required more complex planning. I needed someone to legitimately purchase this property. Someone whose background would satisfy federal scrutiny while giving me continued access to the infrastructure. Dane understood with growing horror. You've been planning this since before Hollister died. The expedited auction, the banking information, everything. Your military communications background made you perfect, Chen acknowledged. Federal investigators would assume you had technical knowledge, while your actual skill set ensured you couldn't interfere with operations you didn't understand. A perfect frontman. Agent Rodriguez finally drew his weapon completely, though his hands shook slightly. This property is surrounded by federal agents. You can't escape. Chen activated a device on his belt, and immediately the sound of distant explosions echoed across the property. Not large enough to kill, but sufficient to disable vehicles and communications equipment. Smoke began rising from the area where the federal command post had been established. Agent Rodriguez, your colleagues are now dealing with multiple equipment failures and communications blackouts. They'll be requesting emergency backup, which will take approximately 40 minutes to arrive from Tucson. More than enough time to complete Phase 2. Chen turned his attention back to Dane. Mr. Calloway, you're going to walk back to Agent Cross and inform her that you've discovered additional underground installations. When she accompanies you to investigate, we'll have a conversation about the real scope of this operation and her agency's future cooperation. Dane looked at Agent Rodriguez's terrified face and made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of walking back toward Cross as Chen demanded, he stepped directly between Rodriguez and Chen's position, using his body as a shield. You made one mistake in your planning, Dane said, his voice steadier than he felt. You assumed I'd prioritize my own survival over doing the right thing. 27 years in the Army taught me different priorities. Chen's expression shifted from confidence to irritation. Mr. Calloway, you're not a soldier anymore. You're a 62-year-old real estate broker who's about to lose everything he's worked for. Be practical. Agent Rodriguez, Dane said without turning around. When I give the signal, run directly toward the excavation site and tell Cross that Chen's teams are positioned around the perimeter. Tell her to call for immediate air support and tactical backup. You're making this unnecessarily complicated, Chen warned, his hand moving toward something on his tactical vest. Agent Cross will cooperate with my requirements regardless of your heroic gestures. The alternative is watching her entire team disappear in the desert. But Dane had spent enough time studying this property to know something Chen had overlooked. The old well behind them wasn't just a water source. It connected to an underground drainage system that ran beneath the entire ranch. During his initial property inspection, he'd noticed multiple access points where the system could be compromised. Rodriguez, check your radio, Dane said quietly. See if you can reach Cross on emergency frequency. Rodriguez fumbled with his radio, while keeping his weapon trained on Chen. After several seconds of static, Cross's voice came through clearly. Rodriguez, report your status immediately. We're reading multiple heat signatures moving toward your position. Chen's confident expression finally cracked. His communications jamming hadn't been as effective as he'd planned, and Cross was already aware of the tactical situation. The federal response would be swift and overwhelming once they confirmed hostile forces on the property. Agent Cross, Rodriguez responded into his radio. Suspect Chen Mingwei is at our location. He's claiming to have teams positioned around the federal perimeter and has made threats against your safety. Request immediate tactical support. Chen activated multiple devices on his belt simultaneously, apparently triggering his backup plan. Distant engines roared to life from various points around the property, vehicles that had been hidden and waiting for emergency extraction. His criminal network was preparing to evacuate rather than engage federal tactical teams in open confrontation. This operation is concluded, Chen announced, backing toward the mesquite trees. Mr. Calloway, your property will remain under federal seizure for the next 5 years while investigators attempt to trace financial networks they'll never fully understand. Agent Rodriguez, inform your supervisor that this infrastructure represents approximately 2% of our actual operational capacity. But as Chen reached the tree line, the sound of approaching helicopters filled the desert air. Multiple aircraft, coming from different directions with the coordinated precision of a major federal operation. Agent Cross had apparently been prepared for exactly this scenario. Chen paused at the edge of the trees, studying the sky with professional assessment. For the first time since revealing himself, he looked genuinely concerned about the tactical situation developing around him. Mr. Calloway, he called back. Your daughter Sarah's medical school loans total $87,000. Remember that number when you consider whether helping federal agents was worth the consequences. The helicopters moved with military precision, cutting off every escape route from the property, while federal tactical teams fast-roped to strategic positions around the perimeter. Chen's evacuation vehicles were surrounded before their drivers could reach the main road. Within minutes, the entire criminal operation was locked down by overwhelming federal force. Chen made one final attempt to reach his extraction point in the mesquite trees, but Agent Cross emerged from behind the barn with a tactical team that had been positioned there since the beginning of the investigation. She'd been using Dane's property walk as a way to draw Chen into the open while her people moved into position. Chen Mingwei, Cross announced with satisfaction, you're under arrest for murder, money laundering, cybercrimes, and threatening federal officers. Your network's finished. Chen surrendered without resistance once he realized the tactical situation was hopeless. His professional assessment told him that fighting would accomplish nothing except getting people killed unnecessarily. As federal agents secured his hands with restraints, he looked directly at Dane with something that might have been respect. "Mr. Calloway, you played your role better than I expected," Chen said calmly. "But my threat regarding your daughter remains valid. Criminal networks don't end with arrests." Agent Cross stepped between them before Dane could respond. "Actually, they do, when we seize all financial assets and arrest every member of the organization simultaneously. Your threats have no teeth when your people are all in federal custody." She showed Chen a tablet displaying multiple arrest operations happening across 3 states. His entire network, the people who'd been processing transactions through the underground data center, had been taken into custody in coordinated raids that began the moment Chen revealed himself at the well. "We've been tracking your organization for 18 months, Cross explained. "Marcus Hollister wasn't just an informant. He was working directly with us to map your entire operation. His death accelerated our timeline, but we were already prepared to move." Dane felt his legs go weak with relief. The federal investigation hadn't been reactive. It had been a carefully planned takedown of an international criminal network. His property had been the final piece of evidence they needed to complete prosecutions that would destroy Chen's organization permanently. 3 hours later, Dane sat in Agent Cross's mobile command center while federal investigators processed the scene. The underground data center had been secured as evidence, but Cross had explained that his cooperation would result in complete immunity and eventual return of his property. "Mr. Calloway, your military background and legitimate purchase made you an ideal, unwitting asset," Cross said. "Chen's mistake was assuming we hadn't been monitoring his recruitment activities. We knew he was targeting you months ago. What about the money he transferred to my account? Seized as evidence, but you'll receive compensation for your auction payment plus damages for your cooperation. The Department of Justice has a fund specifically for situations like this." Cross closed her laptop. "Your retirement plans don't have to change." 6 months later, Dane stood on the same property that had nearly destroyed his life, watching construction crews install new infrastructure for the luxury subdivision he was developing. The federal government had paid him twice the auction price for his cooperation, and the property's notorious history had actually increased its value among buyers who wanted to own a piece of true crime history. Agent Cross visited occasionally to check on the construction progress and update him about the prosecutions. Chen Mingwei had been sentenced to life in federal prison, and his network's assets had been distributed to victims of their crimes. Think about it. Would you have had the courage to step between an armed criminal and a federal agent? Dane's choice changed everything. Dane's daughter Sarah called every Sunday now, her medical school tuition paid in full by the federal compensation package. She'd never known how close she'd come to being threatened by international criminals, and Dane intended to keep it that way. As he watched the sunset paint the Arizona desert in brilliant oranges and purples, Dane reflected on how winning an auction at noon had led to the most terrifying and ultimately rewarding experience of his life. Sometimes the best investments came from the most unexpected places. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and justice collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.